there are 1 million people urbanizing on this planet every week, every frigging week for the next 30 years. If you've got 1 million people moving into cities every week, where do you put them? 94% of tall buildings that exist in the world today, 94% have been built since the year 2000. We're creating an urban zoo, seeing all these icons that cancel each other out. Every single roof plane of every tall building should have public accessible space. Public, not communal, public. The best view, the cleanest environment, it's plantable, you can put vegetation up there. Mass timber is the biggest game changer that has happened in the building industry in my lifetime.
Can you give us your top 5 tall buildings?
Whoa, that's like, what, give me your top 5 meals. Oh.
Most 보던 팟캐스트.
Welcome back to Most Modern. Dr. Antony Wood is one of the leading voices on tall buildings. He was the president and CEO of the Council on Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat and turned it into the global entity that is today. He is currently professor in practice at the Illinois Institute of Technology and the director of the new Masters in Tall Buildings and Vertical Urbanism program. His work has drastically shaped how cities think about height, sustainability, and the future of urban life, and we're really welcome to have him on Most Modern. Welcome to the show, Dr. Antony Wood.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So given your expertise and all the work that you've done, I think people know you as the tall building guy. So let's start with a really quick and simple question. Why do we build tall?
That's not a simple question. There are lots of reasons why we build tall. I mean, historically, but it's still absolutely relevant today. I guess the main driver for high-rise buildings is greater financial return on a plot of land. The reality is you build 20 stories rather than 2 stories, you're going to get more people on that land renting, buying space. So the historic driver for tall buildings was the financial driver, and that's still true today. The finances have changed, though, somewhat. That financial driver in the early days, in the kind of late 19th century, 20th century, was predominantly about corporations. If you take Chrysler or Woolworth, think about that some of the tallest buildings that held the title of the world's tallest, their motivation was, hey, we can get all our people inside one building instead of, spread out around the city or cities. And if we built a beautiful building and we put our name on the top, then we'd get this fantastic branding. And, bingo, you got Chrysler Tower or Woolworth Tower, yeah? And it's interesting that the first, kind of 100 years maybe of high-rise buildings, the predominant office buildings at least, were named after corporations. Think Woolworth, think Petronas. But then there was a shift. About 30 years ago, there was a shift. And that shift was where cities and governments started seeing the value of high-rise buildings for branding a city in the same way that 1930s America, car companies saw that branding in a high-rise building. So, and it's interesting, you look at the titles of some of the most iconic buildings now, and they're more likely to be Shanghai Tower, the Burj Dubai. It's the same thing happening using this tall buildings to brand, but now it's happening on a city and a kind of skyline iconic way rather than just for a corporation. So there are lots of different drivers.
Originally, it was about efficiency, and now maybe more so it's about symbolism and iconicity.
Well, but again, it's not a simple question, not a simple answer. There's many, many other drivers, but the historic one was the finance. Then came in the branding, and these still exist today, and the branding exists, but now the branding's on a bigger scale. It's about branding a city in a competitive world market rather than just branding Chrysler building in a competitive market in New York. But there are other drivers. If we stay with the finances, a lot of these ultra luxury residential towers now in New York and elsewhere are kind of being bought as safety deposit boxes from people who want to get their money invested in safer kind of economic climate. So even the financial thing is very nuanced. But the thing that interests me, and I think we're going to talk about a lot this evening, is the sustainability driver, the urban density driver, the carbon driver, right? And so you've always had this financial thing, and the project needs to stack up. But the reality is, and we're probably going to talk a lot about data tonight, but I'm not going to give you a piece of data that's more important than what I'm going to say right now. And this is United Nations statistics, which show that there are 1 million people urbanizing on this planet every week, every frigging week for the next 30 years. That means we as a species on this planet need to build the equivalent of Chicago every month or so, yeah, to house. And people think that it's this migration from rural to urban. And that is happening. But it's not just that. It's people being born into cities because there's more people in cities. China, India, Indonesia, Brazil, that's happening. But it's also happening in Western countries, you know, because certain Western countries are seen as appealing for immigration. In the US, where I've lived for the last 20 years, you've then got internal migration from Rust Belt to Sun Belt. So these trends of urbanization, it's dead simple. If you've got 1 million people moving into cities every week, where do you put them? And I'll tell you, if you put them...
Does it have to mean tall?
No, it doesn't. But there's kind of 3 models. The predominant model of the last, let's say, of the middle 50, you know, the second half of the 20th century was the American model of the dense downtown core and an ever-expanding horizontal suburb. That's not sustainable. That's not the model moving forward. It's a nice ideal to think everybody could live on a 1/4-acre plot of land. But the energy that it takes to create and operate that city is just far too intense. Also, to say the consumption of land and the loss of land for agriculture and recreation and all those things. So against this backdrop of 1 million people urbanizing, we can't just allow our cities, because of course it's not new cities, it's existing cities, to just grow horizontally. So they've got to grow denser, yeah? And it's as much about the infrastructure and concentrating people and concentrating infrastructure as it is just concentrating buildings. But then, do we need to build tall? Or very, very tall? And the answer is not necessarily. It depends. You know, there are some very dense cities, Paris, London, other places that where it's, you know, a kind of 10-story urban block. So it doesn't necessarily mean everything has to be tall. But the reality is that tall buildings, you know, Alex, you're in Hong Kong. I think it's the best example, really. Hong Kong's got the most tall buildings of any city in the world, and it's one of the densest places. And you know that anything that ever had a wheel is a form of public transport in Hong Kong. You know, the infrastructure is incredible, yeah? So against this backdrop of 1 million people urbanizing, I think we do need tall buildings and we do need vertical growth and we do need that urban density. So there's 3 not so quick answers to your first question. The financial driver, the branding and attention driver, and the, let's call it the sustainability driver, the urban sustainability driver. That's why we have tall buildings. A lot of other reasons, but there's 3 for you. 94% of tall buildings that exist in the world today, 94% have been built since the year 2000. Actually, you could say 94% of tall buildings that exist in the world today have been built since 9/11. And you remember that was going to be the death of tall buildings. We were never going to build tall again. And 94. Now, this study, I should just say, it's actually based on buildings 200 meters or greater in height, but it largely plays out in other height levels. And the only country where that won't be true is America, because there were so many tall buildings that existed in the US and Canada prior to, you know, the turn of the centuries. But again, don't be under the impression that America has not been building tall buildings. America has probably built more tall buildings since 2000 than existed beforehand.
You touch on an interesting subject too, Anthony, which is there are certain places that have just naturally vertical contexts. I'm here in Hong Kong, one of the most vertical, if not the most vertical cities in the world, mostly in East Asia. Middle East is getting increasingly taller. But in the West, in North America, it's much more horizontal. It's much more spread out. So I'm curious, aside from just innate cultural factors, what are the other contextual reasons why there are certain places that build tall and other places that shy away from it?
Well, you know, that's interesting. There are not many places that shy away from it now, really, to be honest, unless, you know, Venice for obvious reasons. So this massive boom of skyscraper construction has impacted almost every region and almost every city. Yeah. But you're right to say that predominantly it's happened in Asia. Yeah, and the Middle East is continentally part of Asia. You know, Dubai and Qatar and these places are also part of continental Asia. So there has been a shift in the tallest buildings. America's not building the tallest buildings in the world anymore. It's still building a lot of tall buildings, but there's been a shift to Asia from North America as the home of the tallest buildings in the world. And, you know, China now has more tall buildings than the rest of the world put together and has built those in the last, 20, 30 years. It goes back to what I was saying before. It still comes down to those three main drivers: financial, ego and attention branding, and the need to house people in a sustainable manner. So if you take a place like Hong Kong had geographical constraints. Hong Kong Island, the tip of Kowloon at Tsim Sha Tsui. So there were geographical constraints that maybe started to drive buildings higher rather than the city more horizontal. You could say the same with Manhattan in New York. You could say the same with Singapore. You can't say the same with Shanghai necessarily, and a lot of other cities that have also grown vertical, except that everybody wants to be as close to the center as possible. But it's not necessarily, I'm slap up against a mountain range and I can't go horizontal anymore, I've got to go vertical, or I'm slap up against the sea or a river. In all cases, I think a lot of it is about ambition. And so there's been three major shifts in the last 20, 30 years, right? The first one is the shift to tall buildings happening all around the world. In 1990, 90% of the 100 tallest buildings in the world were in the US. Now that's 15%. 15% of the 100 tallest buildings in the world are in the US. Yeah. If you'd predicted the world's tallest building 30 years ago, 40 years ago, you'd have said three things with certainty. It'll be in North America, it'll be an office building, and it'll be steel construction. And now the exact opposite is true. It'll be in Asia. In another 10 years, it might be in Africa. But for now, it'll be in Asia, because again, Middle East is part of continental Asia. It'll be a mixed-use building, and it will be composite construction. So that tells you the three big changes that have happened with high-rise buildings. There's been a shift at the predominant location. There's been a shift from predominantly office buildings to residential and mixed use. And there's been a shift from all steel to composite, where steel and concrete act compositely together.
So let's break that down. I guess the question is, why is that happening? So in terms of geography, why are tall buildings happening more in Asia right now, despite the fact that populations are growing all around the world?
Well, it's back to the same three things. It's finances, it's attention, and it's the need to house population. So, all around the world, populations are growing, but populations were not growing at the rate that they were in China and India. Or maybe not the rate, but with the sheer numbers, billions of people, in those countries that were urbanizing and moving from rural to urban. So that was a huge driver, in countries in Asia, combined with, Malaysia has never hidden, Taiwan has never hidden the fact that they built Taipei 101 as the world's tallest building to put Taipei on the map. And Malaysia did the same with Petronas Towers in Kuala Lumpur. And Dubai did the same with the Burj Khalifa. And Jeddah attempted to do the same with Jeddah Tower, which, stalled construction, but is hopefully starting up again. That's about attention. That's using a tall building and the development of a skyline to announce to the world that hey, we're a developed economy, we're a developed nation. And so that has been happening. It's been happening in almost every city in China. I mean, there's even a village of, 250,000 people that's got a super tall building somewhere in China, because they all got together and decided, this village, hey, we'll have a super tall building here as well.
What is it about tall buildings that make it the only option to announce that you have arrived as a city?
Well, I don't think it's the only option. There's quality of life things. There's investments in museums. There's a lot of things. But it's a pretty, it's a pretty quick, easy way to get a lot of attention, isn't it? To build the world's tallest building. Yeah, it's not. That's a 10-year gestation period to build the world's tallest building. It's not going to happen overnight. It's 8 to 10 years by the time you think about it and then actually, finish and open it. But it's been proven, the last 4 or 5 world's tallest have given a hell of a lot of attention to the city that hosts it.
Well, super visible, right? Like you can see it. It leads to an image of a city, but it's also extremely noticeable. For instance, in San Francisco, the Salesforce Tower is visible from every single moment in the city. So there is like you're saying, Anthony, there's an attention factor, I think, both locally, but also in this era of images that are broadcast around the world. So global attention that's going to these places that can build super tall. Anthony, can you just lay out what allowed for us to build tall in the first place in the past 100 years, and then what is the next 100 years of tall building potentially going to look like?
Yeah, so there were technological developments at the end of the 19th century that enabled the skyscraper. The Chicago fire and burning the whole city helped as well, because they had to rebuild it, and that coincided with a time where the definition of a tall building is, the technological definition is that it's a skeletal construction. So up to about the 1880s, we still built buildings by putting stone upon top of stone, load-bearing construction. And here in Chicago, we have several 12, 14-story buildings that are load-bearing construction. But the big breakthrough was the development of the metal frame. Started with an iron frame, very quickly then moved into steel frame. So that carries the load, and then the facade is hung off the metal frame. So there were three things really. It was metal frame construction, skeletal construction, curtain wall for the facade, so not load-bearing facade. The facade is literally hung off the frame like a curtain. And number three, the vertical transport technologies that enabled us to not have to walk up 10, 12 stories, because that obviously was a limit on how high you could go. There's a fourth one as well, which is not often touted, and that is lighting technologies, because these plans became deeper and you needed to have developments in lighting technologies to be able to allow people to inhabit, these deeper plans. So that's what kind of enabled the onset of the skyscraper at the end of the 19th century. And there's been a lot of development since then in all those things, in curtain walls, in vertical transport, in the structural approaches, in the systems inside the building. But, I mentioned a little while ago, and then I'll move on to the next 100 years. There hasn't been, there might have been technological development, but I find most tall buildings bitterly disappointing in terms of what they could be, but what they are. Because the predominant design approach for tall buildings, there's two predominant design approaches. The commercial box, yeah? And that's maybe 90% of tall buildings. It's just a rectilinear, air-conditioned box. It says an efficient floor plan extruded through 20, 40, 60, 80, 100 stories, but it's just a box. It's like, Mies van der Rohe's Seagram building in the 1950s in New York. Incredible. 1950s, curtain wall, all this stuff that we were doing. But we kind of moved on since then. Maybe the facade got a little bit more efficient, but it's still the big rectilinear box because it was such a great commercial animal. So that's one design approach. Now, the other design approach is tall building as piece of icon. How often do you hear this? It's like, I want an icon. But you're right next to an icon, and there's an icon that way. And it's like, all right, well, now we're creating an urban zoo. And it's like we walk down the street and it's like, being in a zoo, seeing all these icons that cancel each other out. And what concerns me is that cities are becoming homogenized. Architecture and tall buildings are doing for the physical side of cities what Starbucks and McDonald's is doing for the dining experience, And in many of these cities, we've got hundreds, if not thousands of years of vernacular tradition in architecture. That's why architecture is different all around the world, because for hundreds, even thousands of years, architecture had to be a response to its unique setting, environmentally, climatically, materially, socially, culturally, physically, all these things. That's why, a Chinese pagoda, an Islamic mosque, a Western cathedral, they're all different because they evolved in a different set of circumstances. And now that's gone out of the window, it kind of went out the window in 1950s modern architecture, this universal architecture. And cities are becoming homogenized, and I think that's a terrible thing. And what I'm interested in is the 5%. So if 95% of tall buildings are not very good, I'm interested in the 5% that are, I think, great. And the reasons they're great is because they are trying to incorporate design, material, social, or technological strategies to be specific to place. And I mean, there are so many different ways that this can happen. But if you take a simple one, like, for example, vegetation, I think that we need to bring as much vegetation back into cities as possible and humanize and de-artificialize cities by bringing in this natural material, bringing it into the urban plane and bringing it into the vertical plane. Vegetation, it differs all around the world because it's a direct response to climate. So if we started to introduce vegetation as a part of the aesthetic, as well as the kind of impact on internal environment and impact on the building, and we did it with indigenous vegetation, then the aesthetic is going to look different from Boston to Shanghai to Sydney, because the vegetation is different. So,
but is that a design problem? Are 95% of tall buildings really boring because that's the least risky and most proven way to build a tall building? Because the building's bigger, it's inherently more risky, right? Like, are tall buildings just inherently risk adverse because of how much is riding on each one of them?
No, I don't think that. I think you're right what you say. It's not about the risk. Because these 5% of buildings that I can show you, buildings they're the opposite of a crap, boring box, right? They do incredible things in form, and they have skybridges and double skin facade and sky gardens and vegetation and mass timber and all this stuff. And guess what? They're friggin' real, and they made a profit for somebody. Do you know what I mean? So why was that risk acceptable? Why can we walk around Singapore and see a vision of what the world could be? Is Singapore far more intelligent than anybody else? Have they got far more money than anybody else? Do they not care about risk? No, they have a greater ambition. That's what it is. They had a greater ambition, and they started to build for this ambition 30, 40 years ago. Whereas in other parts of the world, in the US, it's all financially driven. The whole world, the whole country is market driven, and it's allowed. You will only get better architecture. This is for architecture generally, but let's stay with tall buildings by one of two methods: carrot or stick. Carrot or stick. It's either regulation dictates that things have to be a certain way, or incentive. Gives the incentive for things to be, to move in a certain direction. And that's where Singapore's done a fantastic job, because it has the right balance between carrot and stick. Well, there's no stick in most cities in America, and there's not much carrot either. It's just left to the developer, and so it's not risk. It's not risk. It's, why the fuck should I? It's like, I can just build this box, and people are going to come anyway and live there, and I can build it as cheaply as possible. So why would I spend twice as much? Yeah. Now, there are some developers that do and put, the emphasis on quality and try and do something, but the vast majority don't.
Yeah, I think that's also what I would say characterizes a lot of Asian vertical urbanism, is the public access towards a lot of these spaces that aren't necessarily on the ground. Now, part of that is because of climate, because you want to be in an air-conditioned space in the tropics, and a lot of it has to do with demographics too. But I think a lot of people are quite surprised when they come to a mall in Hong Kong or in Shanghai or in Taipei to realize that all of this space is accessible. You can keep going up. There's a building in Causeway Bay in Hong Kong that has a skate park on the 14th floor, which is quite cool. And then the rest is a mall, and there's an office tower above. So I'm totally a proponent of that, Antony. And I think that that's sort of an area where not just designers, but also everyday people can advocate for more of those types of programs in tall buildings to integrate them a little bit more and not create, I guess, sort of isolated towers that exist despite the surrounding context.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And, I've mentioned a lot about Skybridges, but some of these Skybridge complexes now, the real potential of Skybridges is to bring in wide span structures, big space structures in the vertical realm, because the problem with a tower is it's always going to be a small floor plate. But now, I mean, look at, what's the project in Dubai they just completed last year? You got these 2 towers or 3 towers, and you got this huge horizontal building. It might be 200 meters long, that is actually supported off these towers. So now we're getting potentially big span structures up in the sky, supported off these towers. Tencent building in Shenzhen, the Tencent complex. Tencent, Tencent, it's like the Chinese Amazon or something. And the whole premise of that project by NBBJ was, we want the vertical Google campus. Yeah, so it's 3 towers with these 3 levels of sky bridges, and you go in and you feel like you're in a sports hall, but you're on the 50th floor in a Skybridge, but it's a sports hall, which you would never get in a tall, if it was just a vertical tall building. So, you mentioned skate parks. We can have all kinds of, we can have every function, within, if we design it right.
So how tall is tall? There's a grouping in the building code that talks about specifically tall buildings that's over 70 feet. We call them high rises. There's a grouping in zoning code that gives a name for taller buildings. How do we define them?
Yeah, it's a good question, Minkoo. Depending on your profession. So, for example, a tall building to a fire engineer is it taller than the ladder on the back of a fire truck? That defines it. To a structural engineer, it's something else. To an architect, it's something else. But, as Alex said at the beginning, I led the CTBUH for 20 years and that was kind of the honor of my life doing that. And as part of it, we developed the whole criteria around which tall buildings are defined and measured, because the council has the responsibility for saying which is the world's tallest building, or any variant, which is Chicago's tallest residential concrete building with an offset core, any variant of it. So we took that very seriously. And one of the first things I did when I joined CTBUH in 2006 was rationalize out how we defined and measured tall buildings. And so we came up with something very definitive for what a tall building is. You should be ready for this. A tall building is a building that exhibits some element of tallness. That was our criteria. And it sounds funny, but actually it was very conscious to say that, because it is not a certain height or a certain number of stories. We recognized three things. One was it's about height relative to context. So a 12-story building, you're in Boston right now, Minkoo, a 12-story building in a urban downtown is not particularly tall, but in a suburban setting it is. Number two was proportion, not just height relative to context, but proportion. Here in Chicago, we have the Merchandise Mart, which was pretty tall when it was built in the late 19th century. It was like 12, 14 stories, but it's 3 times wider than it is tall. So you would never look at it and think that's a tall building. And the third subcategory was the building employ technologies that are particular to high-rise buildings, meaning elevatoring strategies, vertical transport, or wind bracing strategy that you wouldn't get on a smaller building. And so this statement of it's a building that exhibits an element of tallness is really saying it's subjective. It's up to the public to decide, but it is really about one or more of these 3 subcategories. Just on that, though, in case you're a little disappointed with that answer, we also defined Supertall, which is not a building that exhibits some element of super tallness. It's 300 meters. And then a few years after that, because we started to see so many buildings of an even greater height, we introduced a new term, megatall, which was 600 meters and above. And I think as we're talking today, there's 4 megatall buildings complete around the world. By the way, I very frequently say that I think 95% of tall buildings are terrible pieces of design and perhaps should never have been built. So you're asking me what are the drivers, and I'm telling you, but I'm not saying it's a good thing.
I think it's all related, and it could be a good segue to my question. What happened to the US? It seemed like the peak skyscraper moment has passed. In the US, we have the financing. I'm sure there are plenty of egos out there, and the cities need to be densified. But why isn't it working in this context?
I don't know that it's quite as pronounced as you're saying there. The difference between America and the rest of the world is that America started building high-rise buildings in the late 19th century. So if you take a city like Chicago or New York or even Boston where you are, there are tall buildings that are 100 years old or more. Mm-hmm. You can't say that about almost any other city in the world. So when you say the heyday of skyscraper construction, was it Art Deco New York? When was it? It depends what you're comparing to. If you're saying right now, yes, there's not that many tall buildings happening in the US right now. And that's partly because of COVID, partly because uncertainty around markets. And again, you can't even say the US because there's been this migration from Rust Belt to Sun Belt. My son's at University of Texas at Austin. I was there a few weeks ago. What? I mean, Austin's like another planet. It's like boom town, But if you're looking at the historic high-rise sense of New York, Chicago, these places, there's not many high-rise buildings happening right now. But 10 years ago there was. Again, I'm not 100% sure about this statistic, but I think Chicago in the last 30 years has built more tall buildings than existed in the 120 years prior. So it depends what you mean. But again, they're not building the world's tallest. They're not building the world's tallest. Why? Because the market doesn't support it. The market doesn't support it. And America is very financially driven. The market drives everything. So that's why we're not building the world's tallest, but we still have been building a lot of tall buildings in America, just not the tallest ones in the world.
I think it's a good moment to then transition to how tall buildings are changing in the 21st century. There's a couple of things that you've already talked about. One is building technology and construction. Two is the emphasis on sustainability. And I want to get to those in a second. But you also mentioned previously the shift away from office. We all know, especially in North America, why that's happened post-COVID. Can you just explain a little bit of how that's impacted building tall?
You go back 30 years ago, the tallest buildings that were happening, or most tall buildings that were happening, tended to be office buildings, and now is probably not the case. It's residential or mixed use, and mixed use is predominantly three functions. It's some combination of office, hotel, and residential. So it might be hotel over office or residential over office or something like that. But the base reason for that is the urbanization rates, growth of cities, and this desire for people. Well, this is interesting actually, because this is a split between Asia and between East and West. Yeah, because post Second World War, especially in Europe, but also in America, there was a need for reconstruction in Europe. So countries in Europe threw up these kind of concrete brutalist towers that were, not necessarily great for people to live in. They weren't maintained, and it took maybe 50, 60, 70 years for Western countries to recover from the bad vibes around high-rise buildings, right? I think it has recovered now, but historically in the West, there were only two types of people who lived in high-rise buildings. It was those who had great economic freedom to make that choice, in other words, very rich, or no economic freedom to make that choice, meaning very poor. So it was either very poor social high-rise towers or mega rich luxurious towers. That wasn't the case in Asia. I mean, Singapore, 80% of people in Singapore live in government-built high-rise housing. Just put those words together. Government-built high-rise housing spells disaster in every frigging Western country that has attempted it. And yet in Singapore, through the Housing Development Board, and 80% of people live in high quality, high-rise housing that's been essentially built by the government. And most of the other 20% live in private built high-rise housing. So you've got a city there that has made this transition to high-rise living for the vast majority of people. And it's not just Singapore, it's the same in Korea and China and other cities in Asia. But what Singapore understood was that it's not just about building the buildings, it's about putting in the infrastructure to support that. And when I'm talking about infrastructure on two levels now. I'm talking about physical infrastructure. So I did my PhD on Skybridges, right? If we're going ever more vertical, we need to bring in the horizontal. You walk around Singapore and it's just incredible. There are like skybridges and green walls and greenery, and the physical infrastructure between, around, and supporting the buildings and the city overall is incredible. But I'm also talking about social infrastructure. Yes, I'm talking about the communal dining spaces at the ground floor and all the rest of it, but I'm talking about financial savings schemes, investments from the government in people, all these schemes that allowed people to move into these apartments and then eventually buy them or whatever. In other words, they did the exact opposite of kind of what was done in the West with these kind of brutalist towers. So I think there is a big difference between still in the West. You see, now there are new populations moving into high-rise buildings, the old and the young. Yeah. So now we have so many student towers in almost every city in the US. It's like student high-rise dorms. But also older people are moving into towers because when they're empty nesters, they don't want to be stuck out in the suburbs. They want to come back into the city close to this activity. But what has traditionally not happened in the West is families. That when So you get married or you meet your partner, you live in a high-rise building, want to have kids, you move out to the suburbs. You raise your family, back in again. But that doesn't happen in Asia. In Asia, I think it's many families living in high-rise buildings and living, to be frank, a higher quality of life in some places than we are in many cities in the US.
No, and indeed. And there's another corollary too, which I think proponents of Singapore will point out, the fact that part of the infrastructure is mobility. And not only is public transportation widely available, but cars are also sort of pushed against. Like, it's very expensive to buy an individual vehicle in Singapore versus in America. I think the automobile really enabled horizontal development while it maybe inhibits vertical development to some extent. And I think that's a good point maybe to get to also the technology side of things and how we've built tall in the past and how we can potentially build tall better in the future. I want to talk about mass timber because that is a building technology that has a specific aesthetic, that has a certain quality to it. And I've heard you talk about why you think mass timber is important, why you think there's a lot of potential here. Could you give us the quick Steelman argument for why we should pursue mass timber at this moment in time?
Mass timber is the biggest game changer that has happened in the building industry in my lifetime. Because up to this moment in time, of the mass timber moment, we need to expend so much energy and create so much carbon in the production of building materials. You know, the production of cement to enable concrete creates more CO2 than the entire airline industry. Yeah. So steel, concrete, and building materials require a lot of energy and release a lot of carbon in their production. By the way, that's getting better. Steel especially is getting better with recycling and, you know, electric arc furnaces. And when we, you know, the more we move towards renewable energy, the more that changes the scenario. But it's dead simple. While we're using all this energy to produce steel or concrete or glass or all these things, the tree is quietly producing itself as a building material without any of our help, thank you. All it needs is soil, air, water, you know, this kind of thing. And it's happily producing itself as a building material. But it's better than that. Because while it's happily producing itself as a building material, it's sequestering the actual carbon out of the atmosphere. So even if we didn't produce any more carbon right now, which would be impossible, but if we didn't, we're still screwed because there's so much carbon already out there. Well, the tree, 50% of a tree will be carbon. It's sucking that carbon out of the atmosphere. So not only are we getting a building material without any energy, manufactured energy, it's actually helping the environment by sucking that carbon out. Now, of course, you know, we've got to cut the tree, we've got to make it into CLT or whatever, and there's energy involved in that. But the energy equation is nowhere near what it takes to produce some of these other building materials. So that's one big thing. It's basically a lot less energy to produce. It's sequestering carbon, yeah? But then there are so many other advantages. I mean, you go and see a high-rise mass timber building, you think, where is everybody? You know, they can build a whole building with one guy in the crane and 4 people because it's all brought on site and it's, you know, kind of modular and it's incredible to see. It's faster, it's cleaner because it's not wet trades. But then the other thing is this, it's a natural material. It's beautiful. You know, it goes back to vegetation, all these other things I've been talking about. You know, we love the connection to natural material. Not only do we love it, studies have shown that it has direct financial benefit. People are willing to pay more to live in a natural environment, meaning, you know, mass timber surfaces. If it's an office environment, productivity is higher. So studies have shown that it's not just nice, but it's beneficial. So, you know, the biophilic properties of being in natural environments with mass timber is also incredible. So it's a win-win, really. And that's why I think it's a major game changer. And I have certainly been advocating major take-up of mass timber, not only in buildings, but in cities as well. You know, now we just saw an extension to the High Line in New York a few months ago, which was this beautiful mass timber bridge. So it's not just buildings, it's cities as well.
What are the major roadblocks towards implementing mass timber, and how do you foresee us getting past those?
By the way, I forgot one important thing, and it is a kind of roadblock. Everything I've just said is just total bullshit if it's not part of sustainable forestry. So really, this game change that I'm talking about is we are now treating trees as crops towards building. You know, it's like we're farming building materials. That's the game changer. But then you need to have respect for that farming of the material, meaning it needs to be part of this sustainable forestry, you know, because we're talking of maybe a 15, 20-year life cycle before the tree is ready to be harvested. So you can't just cut down the tree. It's got to be replanted. And we're learning everything as we go along in terms of we can't be planting in monocultures. We've got to plant like those original forests, and because they're there 20 years, and so they've got to be used as recreational resources and all these other things while they're growing. It's not like a field of corn. So one of the roadblocks is that understanding of the sustainable forestry side and putting that in place, because the life cycle is so much longer. The stewardship is over generations, really. The other roadblock is the fire. People are still nervous about building buildings out of mass timber because it's a flammable material. Yeah, but as we've seen a lot in the last 10 years, there are lots of materials that don't particularly look flammable that are very flammable, especially on the outside of buildings. So, most people that are involved in mass timber don't see that as an issue. We believe that, yes, it is a flammable material, but as long as that is designed for, it's no different to other materials that we're putting in buildings in terms of how to handle it. And then the third big barrier at the moment is supply and demand. It's kind of took everybody by surprise how big, especially in the US, how big this could be. And there's supply and demand problems. There's a lot of forests here in North America, but actually that life cycle of getting it to, into the system to be production to supply the industry is not happening yet. So a lot of the stuff, mass timber that's been happening in the US, well, a lot of it's been coming from Canada, but a lot of it's been coming from Europe as well, from Austria and other places. Although, of course, that might all change with tariffs and everything else. Let's not go there. Let's not go there.
We'll avoid the larger macroeconomic problems, but it does seem to me like the fundamental change is, instead of extracting building materials, which is quick and I guess readily available, we have to change our mindset towards producing and farming those materials in a way that supports our natural ecosystem.
Yeah, absolutely. But think about what you've just said. So what does that mean? That means we've got to start to reforest our countries. Fantastic. They used to be all forests. We cut them all frigging down, yeah? We've got to start to reforest our countries. And if we do that in such a way, like I say, planting in polycultures and combining maybe with agriculture and recreation, then this is it's a win-win for society, as well as just this growing building products. It's about, and that's why we come back to why is vertical important, because we can't allow these cities to continue to grow horizontally, because we need that land. We need that land for so many other things, one of which is agriculture, and I include forestry and mass timber as part of agriculture.
Yeah, so it could be a catalyst. Verticality could be a catalyst for larger changes in society that would benefit us all. It seems like a pretty compelling argument, actually.
Can you give us your top 5 tall buildings?
Oh, that's like what? Give me your top 5 meals. Okay,
they don't have to be ranked. Just 5 buildings.
All right, 5 excellent tall buildings. I love Marina Bay Sands in Singapore. I love so much Singapore, because I told you I did my PhD on Skybridges. But when I talk about Skybridges, people think I'm talking about circulation corridors between buildings, which in some cases, like Petronas Towers, yeah, I am. But there are so many buildings now that are actually bringing urban habitat up into the sky. And although Marina Bay Sands is a private enclave, it's like 3 hotels and, well, it's 1 hotel, but 3 hotel towers, and you got to be pretty rich to stay there and get up and use the swimming pool. It still gives that glimpse of the future of how we could be creating parks and gardens up in the sky. So I love Marina Bay Sands. I'll choose different examples, then you can get why. I love Aqua Tower here in Chicago by Jeannie Gang. That is actually a very simple commercial tower. It's also a rectilinear box, but very beautifully and smartly the balconies project and project into a different curvilinear form. So when you stand underneath Aqua and look up, you don't see that view anywhere in the world. It's a feminine, graceful, curvilinear form to what is, historically a pretty masculine, angular, rectilinear typology.
So yeah, it was a striking image when it first came out. It was called an aquatar because it looked like water.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. So, I love that one. Let's pivot again now. Commerzbank in Frankfurt. On the outside, not so beautiful. Norman Foster, 1997. But it was the first building to create significant sky gardens. Where every worker in that office building has access to a sky garden. It's been done 50 times since then, and it's been done better. But as it was the first one to do it, I think that's a fantastic building. Pick me some cities, and I'll tell you what's the best tall building there.
Well, I'm curious, what's your take on CCTV Tower? Because that's a tall
CCTV
building
in Beijing.
In Beijing, yeah.
Okay, it's not a rectilinear boring box, so it's doing something exciting. But I don't know it's Chinese. I don't know the root is indigenous. I don't know it's a localized thing. You see, that's the other problem. Tall buildings very quickly become synonymous with a place. Synonymous. That doesn't mean it actually belongs there. It just means that everyone recognizes it. 'Cause, like the Burj Khalifa, on many levels, I think the Burj Khalifa is fantastic. But if it was in a different city, it would have become synonymous with that city. I don't know, it's a Middle Eastern building, yeah?
It's not specific, right? Yeah.
Like Petronas Towers, and again, I love Petronas Towers because of the Skybridge and various other things. But if you hear Cesar Pelli, when he presented that project, he believed that was an Islamic tower because the plan is based on the Islamic geometry, the Islamic star. But then it's extruded through 88 stories of modern steel and glass. Yeah.
Who'll be seeing the plan?
Nobody reads the building in the plan. But just a few miles from there is a complex called the Diabumi Complex, which was designed by local architects, BEP, about the same time, which is the same plan. But then it's extruded with a modern interpretation of the Jali screen, which is this Islamic expression on the outside. So it's not a two-dimensional game. It's carried forward. There's another project that I love because it's an Islamic tower in an Islamic city. Yeah. And so here's the test. If you pick that building up and put it in a different city and everyone says, well, that's a bit friggin' weird, doesn't it? What's that Islamic tower do? What's that Middle Eastern tower doing in Boston? Then maybe you've created something that's quite special because it is related in some way to its origin.
I think that's a fantastic
I got 5
list
there, guys, but I got at least 4.
You spent a lot of time too through your work at IIT and your leadership on the new tall building program, thinking about the future of tall buildings. So I want to combine that too with the idea of the human experience. What does it feel like to be in a tall building? What does it mean for society when we're all working together in tall buildings in dense urban environments? So I guess the first question is, how does height change the way that we relate to each other as well as the city around us?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, the simplest thing is the simplest aspect of that is how does it change the relationship to the city? It's obviously as you go up vertically, you start to lose that connection to the ground plane, and that can be quite disconcerting. Actually, it's interesting. I've talked a lot about Singapore tonight, but one of the best architects in the world, in my view, that's developing high-rise buildings is Wohar Architects in Singapore. They've done some incredible complexes, and several of their projects, they might be 80 stories high, but they're built in 10-story villages. Yeah, 10-story villages with the ground plane raised up in the air, and the reason for that is Mun Sum Wong, who's one of the principals at Wohar, grew up in a 10-story kind of apartment complex, and he said you could still stand on your balcony at the 10th floor and still have visual and audio connection with somebody on the ground. Yeah, you could still shout down to them, and then you could still have a conversation. Anything above 10 stories starts to, you lose that. So that's why they create these 10-story villages. The reason I'm saying that is once you go beyond 10 stories, you start to lose that connection with the ground plane. Doesn't mean you lose the connection with the city, because the great thing about a tall building, and I use this as a design tool with my students, is the great opportunity of a tall building as opposed to a small building. A small building is only ever going to relate to the context, the site context around the base. But a tall building, as it rises up in the city, starts to open up a dialogue with places far and wide in the city and other tall buildings. So this can become a kind of way forward for how the mass and skin and, things happen and program can shape because it's not all about the ground plane. The ground plane's important, but it's now starting to have a dialogue with other buildings or the tops of geographical features or, open spaces in the city. So, and then, of course, if we start to link with bridges and raise that ground floor plane. And by the way, when I started my PhD on this, everyone thought I was crazy. The only example was Petronas. And now there are at least 100 high-rise buildings around the world linked with significant sky bridges and urban planes. So it's happening. It's happening all around the world. So so the relationship to the city, your question was two things: relationship to the city and relationship to each other. Relationship to the city, yes, it's very, very different to being in a small building, but it doesn't have to be at the impairment. It could actually be an enriched experience depending on how that building relates to the three dimensions of the city. In terms of each other, again, I think it depends if it's an office building, a residential or hotel or something else. But you've got to put in the infrastructure, social infrastructure inside the building. So that's why, again, 95% of tall buildings are crap, 5% are great. And I've got these 12 design principles for a new high-rise architecture. And one of the principles is every tall building should have sky gardens. Communal spaces where people can come together inside a building. Another one is every single roof plane of every tall building should have public accessible space. Public, not communal, public, meaning the public should be, and I don't mean I mean to the roof. The roof is the most valuable space in a tall building. The best view, the cleanest environment, it's plantable, you can put vegetation up there. And most roofs, what do we fill it up with crap? We put the water tanks and the satellite dishes. It's such a waste and such a shame. So, so the how do we relate to each other? The reality is that in most tall buildings, we don't. I think the most residential, even if you bump into someone in the corridor or in the elevator, you might not know them in the same way that you would in an urban neighborhood of people on your street. But it doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to be that way. If you put in that social infrastructure, community can develop, whether it's office or residential.
Do you think that then through those designs that empowers community even in high rises could help developers make an argument for density in local areas to the community groups that are existing there? Because I ask because I'm a developer, I'm a proponent of density. But when I put together a proposal for even a 6-story, 7-story buildings that's surrounded by 3-story buildings, people come to me and say, you're putting up a monstrosity. Like you're blocking every daylight, which isn't true. How do you win an argument with that?
Well, I think that, first of all, there is a human condition to not want change,
Yeah.
in any,
That's clear.
In any form. So you're fighting that to begin with. But then, I don't live in a high-rise building. I have at various times in my life, but I live in Oak Park. I actually live in the Frank Lloyd Wright Historic District in Oak Park. It's about 7 miles outside Chicago. It's a beautiful, beautiful area. But we had 2 high-rise buildings built just a few blocks away, like 20, 30 stories. And the whole neighborhood came out in arms about these buildings, yeah? Mm-hmm. My argument was it's not the density that's the problem. It's the lack of any kind of ambition in the buildings. They're just boxes, But I tried to talk to the developers there about it. If you actually put in communal facilities and public facilities, if you allowed the public to come up to the roof and all these things, then it would change that perspective. Because too many tall buildings are isolationist. It's like just for the people who live there, and yet they have a massive impact on the city or the town or the urban realm. So they should be. One of the things that the City of London has done really, really well, I think it's done a lot of things not very well, by the way, in terms of a lot of the tall buildings that have happened there. But one of the great things is that every tall building in the city needs to have free public access to the highest level sky gardens. So, the walkie-talkie and, Bishopsgate, 22 Bishopsgate and all these new towers, public can get up there. Don't even have to buy a ticket to go up to this publicly accessible space. And that's what I'm talking about, Then it gives a different perspective, because you feel a bit of ownership if you live in that place. Maybe you could go and have a barbecue on the top or even rent one of those spaces for a party or whatever, and it's not separate, which they are at the moment.
What do you predict is on the horizon? Are we going to get to super tall buildings? Are we getting to more amenitized buildings? What can we think about in the next generation of tall buildings?
Yeah, I think the incredible height has kind of is playing itself out. Yeah, I think we will still see buildings that want to go for the world's tallest. So I don't think the Burj Khalifa will be the tallest forever. There's, Jeddah Tower is starting up again, and that's meant to be 1 kilometer high. And I know of a project in Riyadh that's taller than that, let's say. So I think there will always be this desire to have the world's tallest because of the attention that comes with it. But in the last 30 years, that spawned just, every variation of it. Tallest in city, tallest on street, tallest in district. And I think that's kind of running out now. I think, like China's not building the massively tall buildings that it used to. They're clamping down on that. And I think, that'll be the case elsewhere. But that doesn't mean we're not going to see tall buildings. I think we are going to see tall buildings because the main drivers that I spoke about, and predominantly the population growth and the need for denser, more sustainable cities, especially in Africa and other places that are still developing, is still going to drive them. But in my happiest moments, when I look to the future, I see these tall buildings are all unique to place. They're all, it's a three-dimensional connected urbanism, with bridges and urban planes and all the functions that exist in the ground plane that we rely on. The schools, the doctors' surgeries, the parks, the sidewalks are up there in the sky. It's not just office, residential and hotel, and greenery and mass timber and sky gardens and more functional facades and energy generating technologies. And, it's kind of like what we're doing at the ground floor, but taking it into a three-dimensional urbanism. And that's what I hope is going to happen. That's what I hope our cities are, going to look like in 50 years' time from now.
Well, Anthony, thank you so much for joining us, sharing your knowledge and your leadership on this subject. If people want to know more about your work, about your research, where can they find you and follow you?
Well, for me personally, I'm on LinkedIn. No H in Antony Wood. I think I call myself the tall building guy on there. I'm a professor at IIT, Illinois Institute of Technology, here in Chicago, and that's where I run the Masters of Tall Buildings. And as I said, I was 20 years the leader of CTBUH. So I stepped down from CTBUH, Council on Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat, at the end of last year. CTBUH is a fantastic resource for everything to do with high-rise buildings and increasingly, cities in a broader sense. So that's ctbuh.org. So you can find me at one of those three places.
Yeah, I want to add that CTBUH really provides a robust set of data for tall buildings, including the architecture names and heights and areas and all that. And it helped immensely on my own research as well. So thank you for that. Thank you for providing that data online. Yeah.
Actually, we have a closing tradition on this podcast. It's a question we ask everybody. It's related to the name of the podcast, Most Modern. We've talked a little bit about this subject already, but I want to get your take on it. Not necessarily related to tall buildings, but the reason we're doing this podcast is because we find ourselves in a moment of a lot of change. There's a lot of adjustment and evolution happening in design, in policy, in technology. So we always ask the question, what... You said you weren't going to be stumped.
Yeah, well, when you ask about the time of today, and I hate to finish on a negative note, but I think the problems that we face, we're in the middle of a really dangerous situation right now, and that's it. You can't divorce it from architecture and cities and everything else. It's all about the politics, and what's happening on a geopolitical level around the whole world, but. And it might not seem relevant to buildings and architecture, but it absolutely is on every level. So I'm worried about where we might be, in 2 or 3 years from now. So I don't know if you were looking for me to define a style like most modern or postmodern. I can't do that, Alex. But I'd settle for still being on somewhere near the right path in a few years from now, and not being, the world gone to pot.
Well, I think tall buildings are a good sort of example of things that we're still trying to figure out, right? We're still trying to improve. We're still trying to make up for that 95% that could be drastically made better, while also continuing the possibilities and the mission that the opportunity that tall buildings present. So with that, Anthony, it was wonderful to have you on Most Modern. Thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to continuing to look and reference your research and your leadership and your thoughts on the work, and continuing to see how you view the world as tall buildings continue to sprout up all over the place. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, guys.
Most modern.
Most modern.
Most modern.
Most modern. 모스트 포던 팟캐스트